Morning, good afternoon, good day, class. That's the safest thing to say, I think. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of your session. I'm very sorry that I wasn't here exactly at the start of the class, but that was a time zone error. I thought I was arriving early and it turns out I was 45 minutes late. So these are the sorts of things that happen with these international sessions, but it also allows me to be here in my home in the south of England and speak to you wherever you happen to be, which is a great benefit with no travel expenses, which is even better. So thank you very much, Steve, for the invitation. What I want to do in the session that we have together is to try and expand your view of the importance of risk to successful projects and to take you beyond what is seen as traditional risk management, to give you some ideas about how to answer this really, really important question: how risky is your project? And to give you some practical ideas that you can take away and use when you're managing your own projects. So as I said to Steve, I'm going to speak for probably 45 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end. The reason I keep the Q&A towards the end is simply because often the later part of the presentation answers the questions that you might be thinking of in the earlier part of the presentation. So if you would be able to keep your questions until the end, then hopefully that will be the best way to organize our time together. So as Steve said, I'm known as the risk doctor. I've been the risk doctor for, I guess, about 20 years, but I've been involved in risk management for 35 years, would you believe? I started when I was very, very young. One of the problems I had in risk management right at the very beginning was this precise question: how risky is your project? I learned how to do risk management in a UK defense engineering company, and we learned from the oil and gas sector. And I was given the task in my company of taking the oil and gas risk management approach and tailoring it for our particular type of projects in our organization. And so I did what everybody was doing at the time, which was to identify risks through brainstorming and checklists and a little bit of document review, to prioritize our risks by probability and impact, or you might call it likelihood and consequence, but to take those two dimensions, to prioritize the risks using a heat map, a probability impact matrix, then to work with the stakeholders in the project to develop responses and to work out how we could proactively deal with the right risks that we'd identified in a way that was appropriate and proportionate. Then we would implement our responses and I would write a report and we take it to the project manager and the other stakeholders. So I would go with this risk report that said we've identified 30, 40, 50 risks, and some of them are red, top priority, a few, and then there's a bigger group which are yellow, middle priority, and then there's quite a big group which are green, low priority. And here are the risks and here are our responses. And the project manager and the customer would say to me, that's great, but is that okay? And I would say, well, what do you mean, is it okay? And they would say, well, I understand that there are some red risks and some yellow risks and some green risks, but can you just tell me how risky is the project? And I said, well, here's the list of risks and here are the big ones and this is what we do. They, yes, we understand all of that, but how risky is the project? And is it okay or not? Are we in trouble or is everything fine? And I had real trouble answering that question. I didn't know how to answer the question, how risky is the project? And it was so important because in order to answer, or after you've answered that question, the next most important question is, what are you doing about it? And so I had to struggle with this particular challenge of how to answer the question for my project manager and my project customer: how risky is the project and what are we going to do about it? And the risk register didn't hack it. And the risk report didn't hack it. A list of individual risks didn't answer the question, how risky is the project and is that okay? And so I had to find a different way of answering the question. And that's what I want to share with you today in this session. But before I do that, I have a problem with making my slides advance. So I'm just checking to see. Here we go. Now it's working. That's good. So these are the two questions which I was challenged with 35 years ago. And it took me perhaps 15 years to work out how to answer this particular couple of questions. I'm hoping that I can answer the questions for you, or at least give you to answer the question in much less than 15 years, hopefully in about half an hour. So let's just crack into this subject. How can you answer questions? How risky is your project? And what are you going to do about it? And as project management specialists, project managers or program managers or project control managers, wherever you fit into the project management hierarchy, there are two levels of question. When somebody asks you the question, how risky is the project? You can answer the question at the level of individual risks, and answer the question by thinking about what are the risks in my project. And that's how I started 35 years ago, producing a risk register and then writing that up in a risk report and saying, these are the risks in the project. And so the risk register and the reports were telling us, answering this question, the risks in the project. But that doesn't answer the question of the project sponsor or the project owner or the customer or the business owner, the other stakeholders. How risky is the project? What is the riskiness, what are the risks in the project, but what is the riskiness of the project? And that's a different concept. That's a different question. It's not about a list of risks. It's about some overall assessment, some estimate, some view of how risky the project is as a whole. And to answer that question, a set of individual risks doesn't tell us what we need to know. We need to answer the question about the overall level of project risk exposure. Well, what does that mean? What is overall project risk? We know what individual risks are, but what is overall project risk? Now, fortunately, both the Project Management Institute, the global PMI, of which I'm a fellow, along with Steve, has some answers to these questions. Because I'm in the UK, our national project management body is called the Association for Project Management, the APM. And both PMI are in kind of lockstep in terms of the way that we approach at least risk management, partly because I've been involved in influencing the discussion on both sides of the pond. But what do PMI and APM say about how to define individual risk? Hopefully you can tell me what at least one of these definitions is. You should be very familiar with them. In the PMBOK guide, and I'm referring here to the 6th edition, which was published in 2017, a risk is defined as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project's objectives. I hope you're fully familiar with that. The key thing is that the risk is an uncertainty. It's either an uncertain event or it's some uncertain condition, but it's not any uncertainty. It's an uncertainty that matters, and it matters because it could affect our objectives. And of course, you can have good risks as well as bad risks. We can have upside risks as well as downside risks. We might call them opportunities and threats. And that's why the PMBOK guide definition has positive or negative. In the UK, our body of knowledge, the APM BOK, has a very similar definition, which was first introduced in 2004 in something we call the PRAM guide, the Project Risk Analysis and Management Guide. And here the definition is very similar: an uncertain event or set of circumstances that, should it occur, will have an effect on achievement of objectives. So this should be very familiar to you. But what about this idea of overall project risk? In fact, both PMI and APM also have in their risk management guidelines definitions of something called overall project risk, in addition to definitions of individual risks. Individual risks are the risks in the project. Overall project risk is the riskiness of the project. And so the PMI in the PMBOK guide, 6th edition, says overall project risk represents the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. And it's more than the sum of individual risks on a project. You can't somehow add up all of the individual risks to get some kind of overall risk rating. It doesn't work like that because of the problems of combining uncertainties and thinking about variable impacts which may or may not occur. If you've got 50 or 100 risks on a project, it will be very difficult to try and work out what the overall effect might be. So overall project risk is the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. The APM says something very similar in the APM body of knowledge. It's the exposure of stakeholders to the consequences of variation in outcome. So it says a similar sort of thing. It's about the whole project and where is the uncertainty in the whole project as perceived by the stakeholders in that project. And it arises from an accumulation of individual risks, yes, but together with other sources of uncertainty. So you'll find that both of these standards, the PMI PMBOK guide and the APM body of knowledge and other standards in project risk management, have these two levels of definition of risk, individual risks and overall project risk. So with two levels of risk and risk management, individual risks are described in these guidelines as specific events or conditions that might affect project objectives positively or negatively. And this is what our standard project risk management process is designed to address. We list individual specific risks, we develop responses to individual specific risks, and we report on individual specific risks. But when it comes to overall project risk, this is something that applies to the project as a whole, and it needs to include all sources of project uncertainty, not just individual risks. And it's something which is not part of the day-to-day management of the project. It's something which is really the area of strategic decision-making, program and portfolio management, and overall project governance by the stakeholders. So you'll see here there are two different levels. Individual risk is down in the weeds of the specific things that might or might not happen that could affect the success of our projects. Whereas overall project risk is an overarching concept that looks at the project as a whole and helps us to prioritize the project, to see the project in the context of the overall program, to reflect the riskiness of the project to our customers and to our wider stakeholders through project governance. What does that have to do with us as project managers? We know that we're responsible as project managers for identifying, analyzing and managing individual risks. That's clear, and we've known that for many decades. But what about overall project risk? If we're responsible for identifying and managing individual risks, we are accountable to the project sponsor or the business owner for the overall riskiness of the project. We have to report to them if our project is okay. How is the project in terms of being on track or not towards successfully delivering our project objectives? And the project manager has to answer that question as well. So of course we need to know what are the individual risks that we list in the risk register, and we need to report on our progress in managing those proactively. But the program sponsor or the project sponsor is going to ask the question, how risky is the project and is it okay? And so this is in scope for us as project management professionals. We need to be able to answer both of these questions. What are the risks in my project? And what is the risk of my project? Okay, well, if it's in scope, how are we going to do it? It's all very well for the PMI, the PMBOK guide, and other standards to say, yes, there is a thing called overall project management, and yes, it is important, and yes, you need to be able to do something about it, but how? There are some hints actually in the 6th edition of the PMBOK guide in how to address overall project risk. And you'll find similar guidance in the PMI risk management standard and in other standards. But for most people in practice, in real organizations in the real world, this doesn't feature. Most of us don't know how to answer this overall project risk question. And that's what I'd like to address in the next half an hour. So currently, most projects only concentrate on managing individual risks, and that's what our standard risk management process is for. And I call that explicit risk management. It's kind of open, we're managing risk, we're doing risk management to manage individual risks. And that's what most of us are used to doing. But overall project risk is managed implicitly. It's managed through the way that we handle the whole project, because overall project risk is a whole project feature, a whole project characteristic. So it's not managed only through the risk management process, it's managed much more broadly through the kinds of decisions that we make through when we're managing the project as a whole. So we might separate the two in this kind of way. Usually, overall project risk is only considered during project initiation. So when we're making decisions about the structure of the project, how are we going to put together the different elements? How are we going to run it through? What's our project management process and approach? When we're thinking about the scope of the project, what functionality or what benefits are we trying to produce? What is in the project and what is not in the project? when we're thinking about content and context of the project as a whole, we're addressing the overall riskiness of the project. And usually we only think about those things when we're setting up the project, when we're writing the project charter or the project scope statement, or we're writing the business case. We're thinking about what is in the project and how risky are we prepared for it to be. And then once we launch the project, we have a project risk management process that Steve was explaining to you earlier to address the individual risks. So we do implicit risk management when we're thinking about the riskiness of the whole project only during project initiation. Then once we press the big green button and we start the project, then we switch to managing individual risks in the project throughout project execution. Now, I don't think that's right. I think as project managers, we need to be thinking about the overall riskiness of the project right the way through the project lifecycle, right the way until we deliver the project and we hand it over to be used to create benefits and value. So how do we think about the overall riskiness of the project outside of just the setup phase of project initiation? How do we understand and manage overall project risk during project execution? Let me suggest to you that we can use the same kind of steps that you will be familiar with in managing individual risks to think about understanding and managing overall project risk. So we can think about identification, quantifying, responding, and reporting as 4 important steps in the way that we manage overall project risk. What is the overall project risk? How risky is my project? How big is that risk? We can quantify it. What are we going to do about it? And what are our response options? And then who are we going to tell and how are we going to communicate that? So I'd like to talk about these 4 particular steps of managing overall project risk, not just in the project initiation phase, but throughout project execution. So let's start with identification. How do we identify project risk? We're taking a whole project perspective. We're looking at what makes the project risky. And so here we're thinking about the sources of project risk. When you identify individual risks, you want to know what is the risk. When it's overall project risk, there is just one thing, the overall riskiness of the project. So we don't need to identify the overall project risk. We want to know, where has it come from? It comes from the context of the project. And we can think about what those sources of overall project risk are as a way of helping us to understand what we need to do to manage the riskiness of the project as a whole. So what can we use to identify sources of overall project risk? There's a number of different frameworks that we can use, and you might be familiar with at least some of these. You've probably heard about the PESTLE framework. PESTLE stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So we've got here 6 headings. It's a kind of prompt list of the sorts of things we need to think about when we're thinking about risk. So PESTLE is a good way to think about the overall riskiness of the project. What are the political sources of risk, the economic sources of risk, the social, the legal, and so on. There are other similar frameworks. You might have heard of an extension to PESTLE called PESTLEAD, which adds in, and I've got a crib sheet here just to remember these. I is usually international, but some people think it also could or should mean information. And D stands for demographic. What are the risks of the overall project that come from the people aspects in the context of our project? There's another extension of PESTLE called STEEPLE, which is exactly the same. It's just got an extra E. The 2 E's in PESTLE stand for economic and environmental, but with STEEPLE, we're adding in ethical risks. There's another extension called INSPECT. That's innovation, social, political, economic, communications, and technology. I'm going to give you a handout which includes all of these, by the way. And then there's another one which is also similar called Spectrum. S is socio-cultural, political, economic, competitive, technological, regulatory, general uncertainties, and marketplace. And then 2 more that you may have come across, TCOP, which is particularly common in the oil and gas sector, technical, environmental, commercial, operational, and political. And finally, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I mean, these are all lots and lots of letters, lots of categories. The point here is that these are prompt lists. These are headings of potential sources of risk that could affect the overall project. We're not talking about identifying individual risks from these headings. We're talking about thinking about how risky the project is as a result of influences from each of these categories. So we can use these frameworks as a prompt list. We can use them as an agenda for our brainstorm. We can use them as an agenda for interviewing key stakeholders, or as input to a SWOT analysis, or any of the standard risk identification techniques that you're used to. The point is to maintain the whole project perspective. What is there out there that makes my whole project risky? We need to understand that. Some of those influences will be very strong and very significant and really major and critical. And some of those sources will be minor and just small influences that have a little influence, a little effect on the riskiness of the project. So it is important that we prioritize the sources of overall project risk. And in standard risk management, qualitative assessment or qualitative analysis is the step that we use to prioritize risks. So we normally would think about risk having uncertainty or a probability and impact, uncertainty and the effect on objectives. So normally in traditional risk management, we're assessing these two dimensions for individual risks. We could do the same for overall project riskiness. We could think about similar two dimensions, the uncertainty dimension and the effect dimension. But here we're maintaining a whole project perspective. So we're thinking not about how likely or unlikely a particular individual risk is to happen. For the whole project, the uncertainty element of overall project risk is how uncertain is my project, which we might express as the probability of project success, or conversely, the probability of project failure, depending on how you view it. It's the same thing, of course. The probability of success is 100 minus the probability of failure. So, and then we have to think about the effect in terms of how risky the project is as a whole. We need to think about the riskiness in terms of the effect on the overall project. And when we're thinking in a whole project perspective, we're thinking about the range of potential variations on overall project objectives, the outcomes that could happen for our projects. And these are expressed in our project objectives, which could be achieved more or less than what we want them to be. So there'll be a range of potential variation, which reflects the uncertainty associated with the whole project. So we might think of budget. We've set a budget. There's a variation of what might happen in that budget for the project as a whole, under budget or over budget. And that represents the effect of the uncertainty on the project as a whole. So qualitative assessment in individual standard project risk management is about assessing probability and impact, or uncertainty and effect, for individual risks. To overall project risk, and we're asking these questions: what is the probability of project success, and how much variation is there in the project? There's only one value for overall project risk at any point in time. So right now, my project has a given probability of success. And right now, with the uncertainty that's in the project, there is a potential variation in how the project might turn out. But next month, there might be a different probability of success and a different range of potential variation. But right now, there's only one thing I'm assessing. The overall project risk has a level of uncertainty and a level of variation. So qualitative assessment as such isn't really very useful to us when we're assessing overall project risk. The use of a standard PI matrix doesn't really help us. We'd only have one spot on the matrix which shows where the project is right now. That doesn't particularly help us in terms of doing anything about it. Although we could perhaps plot the position of the project on the PI matrix over time and see how it moves. And I'll come back to that later on when we talk about team. So qualitative assessment isn't really very useful. What about quantitative analysis? How can we quantify overall project risk and decide how big it is? After all, we're trying to answer the question, how risky is the project? So if we're answering the question, how risky is the project, or to take the questions from the PMBOK guide and the AP of knowledge, we're trying to quantify the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole, or how exposed our stakeholders are to the overall variation in project outcomes. Now, these are questions where the answers are numbers. If we think about probability and impact, the overall project has a certain probability of success. Well, how likely is them to succeed? That's a number. And if we're thinking about the amount of uncertainty in the overall project in terms of variation, the range of possible values against our objectives, well, that range in variation is numbers. It's a range that is plus something and minus something. So we have questions where the answers are numbers. And if we want to answer questions where the answers are numbers in terms of risk management, we use Monte Carlo simulation. We use quantitative risk analysis. And fortunately, standard Monte Carlo simulation that we're all used to using, or perhaps most of us are used to using. Anyway, it's an established set of techniques with good tools and processes that are available to everybody, can answer these key questions where the answers are numbers. So if we want to answer the question, how risky is the project? Standard Monte Carlo simulation can help us to answer the question using numbers. Now, let me just show you how we can do this. And I appreciate that not all of you will use quantitative analysis in the risk management of your projects. So some of this might be new to some of you. I'll try and be gentle with you. But if this is something that you're not familiar with, you might just need to do a little bit of background reading to kind of catch up and fill in the gaps. So let's imagine that we're going to do a Monte Carlo simulation on the cost outcome of our project. And hopefully you'll be familiar with an S-curve, something like this, as an output of quantitative risk analysis. So what we're doing is we're modeling all of the sources of variability and uncertainty within our project. We're simulating the project hundreds or thousands of times using a basic computer program, which you can do on a simple laptop. You can do it on your phone, actually, if you want to quantify using Monte Carlo simulation. And we're looking at the range of things that might happen to the project here in terms of the outturn cost. And what this graph shows you is that under no circumstances will the project ever cost less than $2 million. All of the results of the simulation are to the right, are more expensive than $2 million. So that's an absolute minimum in terms of the possible overall cost of the project. And we can also see it's never going to cost any more than 2.8 million. So we've got here a range of possible outcomes of the cost from the project from a standard Monte Carlo simulation. Now, how can this answer the question, how risky is the project, using numbers? Well, you'll remember we're looking for two things. The first is the probability of project success, and the other is the range of variation. That's how we're going to quantify the riskiness of the project. So from here, we can only tell what the probability of success is if we know what the target cost is. So let's just imagine for this particular project, the target cost is 2.2 million, which appears here about a third of the way along the x-axis. From this S-curve, we can read off the probability of this project coming to completion at or below $2.2 million. And it comes out at about 23%. There's a 23% chance of meeting the project target. So we're directly answering the question, what is the probability of project success from our Monte Carlo simulation? This graph shows at the current stage where we are in the project with the uncertainties that we know about, the chances of us achieving the project cost goal is 23%, which means there's a 77% chance that we're going to miss it. That doesn't sound too good, does it? We'll come back to that in a moment. So that's one half of quantifying overall project risk. What is the probability of project success? We can read it directly from the S-curve, about 23%. If we want to ask the question about variability on this cost outcome, we can tell that from the S-curve as well. You'll see that the curve runs from 2 million to 2.8 million. Generally, the extremes are quite extreme. We're very unlikely to get the absolute minimum or the absolute maximum. So it's common to come in a little bit from those extremes, generally by about 5%. So we would read the variability in the project from the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile, which in this case is a variation of about 500,000. So it's from somewhere between about 2.1, just over 2.1 to just under 2.7. So we've got about $500,000 of variability in the cost outcome on a target of 2.2. And if you look at where that range of uncertainty lies, you'll see it's a little bit below and quite a lot above. So we know that the variability, there's a lot of downside, a lot of extra cost that could happen to our project because we've got a 77% chance of cost overrun, but we can quantify that. And we can also say from this curve, what is the expected cost? If we don't do anything, where do we think our project will actually end up in terms of overall project cost? And it's coming in at about 2.35. It's about $150,000 overspent. Not too good. And if your project stakeholder said, I'm not very happy with a 23% chance of success, I need a target which is going to give me more confidence of being able to achieve it, we could read off, we can associate values of overall project cost with confidence levels. So if your project stakeholder or your program manager said, I need an 85% certainty of the cost that we're going to come in at, we could read that off here. The 85th percentile is 2.45 million. So we can say, actually, if we wanted to increase our confidence of project success from 23% to 85%, then we've got some work to do to move the curve so that we actually have that level of success. That's what the graph shows us. We could see that in numbers. To answer the question, how risky is the project? We're asking the question, how likely is the project to succeed? So we've got a 23% chance of hitting the target, a 77% chance of missing it, and we expect to be $150,000 over, which is a 7% increase in the cost target. If we're asking about variability, we're seeing that the potential range of variation is 22% of the project value, $500,000 on 2.2. That the best case is a 4% underrun of 2.1, and the worst case is an 18% overrun of 2.6. So we're beginning to quantify the riskiness of the project. We could go to a project manager or a program manager or a stakeholder or a business owner with these numbers and say the riskiness of the project as we have it, with these sources of risk that we've identified, is that there's about a 1 in 4 chance of project success in terms of cost, and that we think we're going to be overrun by 7%. There's a possibility, a small chance we could underrun. In fact, it could be as bad as maybe almost 20% over target. Now we can answer the question, is that okay? And you know what the answer is going to be, don't you? Almost certainly. A 23% chance of success with a possibility of a 20% overrun. And we know we're almost guaranteed to have a 5 to 10% overrun at this stage. We need to do something, which means we need to answer this next question. What are you going to do about it? And it's really important that we move from analysis to action, whether we're talking about individual risks or overall project risk. What are you going to do about it? Risk management is about managing risk. Risk analysis is fine. You can analyze the risk and decide what it is and how big it is, but risk management, you have to do something. And when we're thinking about overall project risk, we still have to do something. It's really important that we don't just analyze the overall project risk exposure, report on it, and then say, okay, there we are. I'm very sorry. That's my job done. We have to do something about it. And the person who's going to do something about it at the overall project level is the project sponsor. The project sponsor owns the overall project, obviously in collaboration and in partnership with other stakeholders and working through the project manager, but the project sponsor is the one who has to manage the overall riskiness of the project, advised by the project manager. So what can we do to change the overall project risk exposure, the overall level of project risk? The response options that we have are very similar to the response options for individual risks. So that's helpful because we already know what those are. We can think about them under the same headings. So for example, if we have a really bad result, a prediction from the quantitative analysis like the one I've just shown you, there's only a 1 in 4 chance of success of meeting our cost target, and we think we could be certainly 5 to 10% over, possibly 20% over, we need to do something. We can avoid overall project risk in a number of aggressive ways. This is a fairly sort of strong style of response. There are other types of response which are not quite as aggressive as risk avoidance. But in terms of avoidance, we might decide to find the high risk elements and just cut them out, to de-scope the project. We might think about changing the priority of the project. We might think about deciding things that we were going to do now, we'll cut the project in half, we'll make that into a later phase or even a separate project. In the worst case, we might decide that the risk exposure is so bad that the right decision is to cancel the project altogether. And that would be risk avoidance in its purest form. There's no risk if there's no project. Hopefully we don't have to do that too often. You're familiar with the idea that risk includes both threats and opportunities, and there are upside risk responses for opportunities that parallel the downside risk responses for threats. And you'll find in the PMBOK guide, paralleling avoidance for threats, we've got exploiting for opportunities. And we can also exploit upside overall project risk. So if we came in with the results of quantifying overall project risk exposure to say, do you know what, we've got a 90% chance of succeeding on this project. In fact, we're almost certain to underrun on the budget and come in early and have lots of extra functionality. We might want to actually do something to exploit that upside opportunity. For example, we might choose to increase the scope in order to create additional value. We might spin off daughter projects. We might go for incremental deliveries where we're delivering functionality early in order to improve our cash flow or our market position. We can exploit overall project risk exposure if it's upside in the same way that we could do for individual risks. Similar to the individual risk exposure types, response types of transfer and share, we could transfer or share upside or downside overall project risk exposure. Remember, we're thinking about decisions on the future of the whole project, not individual bits of the project, not individual activities, but the project as a whole. So transferring and sharing overall project risk exposure is involving third parties, somebody else, to help us to manage the risk on the project, perhaps using joint ventures or special purpose vehicles, using contractual forms of sharing risk. We could maybe merge with another company, or we could acquire a company to help us to manage the overall risk on the project. We could subcontract parts of the project, or maybe even sell the project as a whole. These are transfer or share responses. If we don't want to do that, we can work in terms of reducing a negative risk exposure or enhancing a positive risk exposure. What we're trying to do here is to move the point of the probability of success or failure towards the right. You saw on that S-curve, there was only a 23% chance of success. What we need to do is to move that up. So it's more than 50% chance of success. And to do that, we need to identify the sources of risk on our overall project, which are pulling the project down, and to address those sources of risk to reduce their influence on the project. We need to find the sources of risk which are enhancing our probability of success. And we need to make sure that we strengthen their influence on the project to move us up to the right, to increase the probability of success. And in terms of that variation of the potential outcome, we saw there was a big cost variation possible of something like, what was it, 7%? No, 20%, that's right, sorry, 22% variation on the cost of the project. We want to reduce the variability. So we're bringing in the ends of the S-curve. We're turning the S-curve from a shallow slope to an upright slope. We're reducing the variability, and we're shifting it down. We're putting a left shift on our S-curve to make sure there's less variability and it's spread to the upside. It's spread to cost savings. And we can design our responses to do that. And then you'll remember there's a final response option in the PMBOK guide, which is to accept the risk, except with a contingency plan, to have a backup plan that says, if this happens, this is what we're going to do about it. And to monitor that contingency. And as I heard Steve saying, have both contingency plans and management reserve. This is what management reserve is for, to deal with the riskiness of the overall project. So once we know what our level of overall project risk is, and we've quantified it, we can answer the question, what are you going to do about it, in quite a sophisticated way, because we have a wide range of potential response options to address overall project risk. And the project sponsor, in collaboration with other stakeholders and working through the project manager, should be thinking about implementing some of these response options to make the overall riskiness of the project less. Now we need to tell somebody what we've done. And a final question I just want to spend 5 minutes on before we open up to some discussion is to think about how we talk about overall project risk. If you go to program managers or customers with S-curves and start showing them dots and dashes and points on an S-curve and talking about percentages and variability, a lot of them will just glaze over. We need a different way of reporting overall project risk. What we need to do is to update our view of overall project risk at key milestones in the project. This is not just something we do at the beginning of the project. We do it at every gateway, at every key phase point, at every key delivery. Whenever something changes, if there's a major change element in the scope of the project, or if something happens which is key in the life of the project, we need to look again at the project riskiness as a whole. And then we need to tell our stakeholders. So we need to be reporting on the current level of overall project risk exposure and what makes it happen. What responses have we designed and implemented in order to address that overall project risk exposure? And which way is it taking us? Are we getting better or worse? And where do we think we're going to be this time next month or next quarter? So these are our kind of standard reporting elements, and we need to be able to monitor changes and trends in overall project risk exposure. And at this point, we hit a bit of a problem. Some of the things I've talked about so far are in the PMBOK Guide Risk chapter, chapter 11, and they're in other risk management and project management guidelines. But nowhere in common practice will you find accepted good reporting formats for overall project risk. Some companies have tried designing dashboards and different things, but there's no commonly accepted way of reporting on overall project risk exposure. So I'd like to suggest one way that you might visualize overall project risk in a way that makes it helpful to report it to your project stakeholders. And that's something that I call the Project Risk Barometer. Now, a barometer looks something like this. It measures pressure, usually air pressure. And so what we're thinking about is the pressure that risk causes in our projects. And you'll see here that it has 3 different zones. What I want to suggest is that we should, for our overall project risk exposure, for the project as a whole, have a view of what level of risk exposure is completely unacceptable for the project as a whole. And that would be our red level on the risk barometer. Below that probability of success, we've got a problem. We might have a level of success for the project, which is kind of okay, not great. We would perhaps set that level of the probability of success at a kind of medium yellow zone. And then we'd have a green zone, which says, well, if our project is here with this level of success, that's fine. And the boundaries I've just suggested here, 50% and 80% as the boundaries, that would need to be agreed and discussed by your project stakeholders. For this project, what level of probability of success is completely unacceptable? We need to get above that. Where is that threshold? And this is about reflecting the risk appetite of your project sponsor, your business owners, and your key stakeholders. So that's what a project barometer looks like. And we would use it like this. We would create a plot where we show for the project as it progresses, what is the overall probability of success as time passes. So we show for the project example, and here we're showing a cost example. There was about a 23% chance of success. Actually, that's a little bit lower than 23%. But just now at our review point, this is where the project sits. Right in the middle of the red zone, we're in trouble. Then as we go through the project, maybe a month later, we have another review. And so we assess the overall riskiness of the project. And maybe we find it's increased a bit, or maybe it's gone down a bit. We can review the overall project riskiness and plot the probability of project success on a graph like this within the zones of the project risk barometer, right up to time now. And we could add a trend line that would show us if things continue as they are, where do we expect to be? Now, this very simple visualization is something that you could put on the table of your program manager or your project sponsor or your customer. Somebody who would actually be able to say, this is where we are, this is where we come from, and this is where we think we're going. Of course, probability of success is only half of the picture for overall project risk exposure. The other half is variability. So we could show that on a similar combined graph where we say that right in the middle of the yellow zone is our target, where the project objective is. If we're under target, that's good. If we're over target, that's not good. And we could plot the 5 and 95% points from the S-curve in something looking like this. Here's our 23% chance of hitting the target, and it could be a little bit under or quite a lot over. And as we monitor the movement of the S-curve with time, we should see the boundaries, the edges of the S-curve, both coming in and moving left, which would change the variability that we can plot on our graph, something like this. And if things were going well, it might look in this general upward trend, and we could draw a trend line similarly that says this is where we expect the variability to go. So this simple visualization of Project Risk Barometer should help us to report progress in overall project risk exposure to those stakeholders who need to see it, who are not familiar with interpreting S-curves. Well, I think I've almost come to the end of my time, so let me just wrap up some final thoughts. What do we need to do if we're going to put this into practice? I think it's really important. As I said 35 years ago, I was confronted with the question, how risky is the project? And I had no answer. And it might be that if your project owner or your project sponsor or your customer asked you, so how risky is your project or my project, you wouldn't be able to answer either. And that's really worrying. We should be able to answer that question. As we look through things like the PMBOK guide and the APM body of knowledge and other guidelines, we find some hints and some clues, but we really need to do better. We need to put this into practice. Risk is really important. Risk is what makes the difference between success and failure on our projects. And our ability to succeed in managing risk is directly proportionate to our ability to succeed in delivering our projects. And this is important at both levels of individual risks, the risks in the project, and the overall riskiness of the project, the risk of the project. Both of these things are so important that we need to manage them proactively. We can't just sit back and see what happens. We've got to get stuck in early on to influence our overall risk exposure as well as our individual risks. And best practice and common practice needs to move on this. It's not enough just to have something in the standards. We need to put it into practice. There is some guidance in the project management and risk management standards, but not enough. We need to learn how to do this properly and learn how to do it better, dealing equally importantly with the risks in the project and the riskiness of the project. So let me just leave you with some questions before I allow you to ask me questions. And I guess you know what my first two questions are going to be. How risky is your project and what are you doing about it? And if you can't answer that question, you have to answer this question. Are you including overall project risk in your thinking and practice? It's in the PMBOK guide, it's in the risk standards. If you're not including it in the way you think about the riskiness of your project, why not? If you're not doing it, could you do it? And what changes do you need to make to the way you think and behave towards risk in order to manage overall project risk as well as individual project risks in your project? Well, that's all I want to say. I hope you found that stimulating and challenging and interesting, and hopefully ultimately useful. I have provided these slides to Steve and to the teaching assistants, and also a conference paper that I wrote, which gives some more detail and some references on some of the things that I've proposed in this presentation. But I hope you found it interesting and useful. I'm going to stop sharing my slides just now and then see if we can spend some time with questions.